The temperature inside Ezra Dalton's cabin held steady at 68 degrees, while 3 feet of snow buried the roof and wind howled at 70 miles per hour outside. Through the small window, he could see smoke rising from Henry Blackwell's chimney a quarter-mile away, thick and desperate. And he knew his neighbor was burning through his winter wood supply, trying to survive the third day of the blizzard that would later be called the worst winter storm in Appalachian history. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier survival and innovation move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's story might just change how you think about the ingenuity hidden in America's mountains. The year was 1867, and the Blue Ridge Mountains of southwestern Virginia were entering what would become one of the coldest Decembers in living memory. Ezra Dalton had survived 11 winters in these mountains, trapping beaver and marten along the upper tributaries of the New River. He was 39 years old, competent with an axe and rifle, and careful in ways that kept men alive in country where carelessness meant death. He had built his cabin 3 years earlier using techniques his father had taught him in Tennessee, and he considered himself adequately prepared for whatever winter might bring. His younger brother Thomas lived 2 miles downstream in a similar cabin. Thomas was 34, married with 2 young children, and worked a small plot of cleared land in addition to running trap lines. The brothers saw each other weekly during winter months, checking on supplies and sharing news from the scattered mountain community that stretched along 15 miles of creek valleys and ridges. On December 14, 1867, the temperature dropped from 40 degrees to 8 degrees in less than 6 hours. A cold front swept down from the northwest, bringing clear skies and brutal cold that penetrated every gap in every cabin wall. Ezra spent that evening feeding his fireplace constantly, burning through half a cord of split oak just to keep his cabin tolerably warm. Even so, frost formed on the interior walls near the floor, and he slept fully clothed under 2 wool blankets and a bearskin. The next morning, Ezra walked to Thomas's cabin to check on his brother's family. The smoke from Thomas's chimney was absent. From 50 yards away, Ezra knew something was wrong. Smoke should have been pouring from that chimney on a morning this cold. He ran the last distance and found the cabin door unbarred. Inside, the fireplace held only gray ash. Thomas's wife and children were huddled under blankets in the sleeping loft, alive but dangerously cold. Thomas himself was not in the cabin. Ezra found his brother 20 yards from the cabin door, frozen solid in the snow. Thomas had apparently gone out during the night to retrieve more firewood from the woodpile. Whether he had slipped and struck his head or simply become disoriented in the darkness and cold, Ezra would never know. What was clear was that Thomas had died within sight of his own home while his fire died and his family slept. Ezra carried Thomas's body inside and restarted the fire. He spent the next 3 days at his brother's cabin, helping Thomas's wife arrange for the children to go stay with her sister in the lower valley. They buried Thomas on a ridge overlooking his homestead on a bitter cold afternoon with 6 neighbors in attendance. That night, back in his own cabin, Ezra sat before his fire and thought about what had killed his brother. Ezra spent the winter of 1867 through 68 visiting every cabin within 10 miles of his homestead. He was not socializing. He was studying how people heated their homes and how they survived the cold months that could stretch from November through March in the high country. What he found was a pattern of desperate inefficiency that most mountain families simply accepted as the price of living in the wilderness. Every cabin used the same basic approach. A fireplace built of stone or clay occupied one wall. Wood burned constantly during cold weather. Families slept as close to the fire as safety allowed. And despite all this effort, people froze. Henry Blackwell's cabin was typical. Henry was a competent farmer and hunter who had lived in these mountains for 15 years. His cabin was well built by conventional standards, with logs notched at the corners and chinked with mud and moss. His fireplace drew adequately, and he kept several cords of split wood stacked under a shed roof beside his cabin. But when Ezra visited on a January afternoon, the interior of Henry's cabin was filled with smoke, despite the chimney drawing. The temperature 10 feet from the fireplace was perhaps 45 degrees. Henry's wife and 3 children wore layers of clothing indoors. Frost covered the cabin walls, anywhere the fireplace heat did not directly reach. Henry was burning approximately 1 full cord of wood every 5 days just to maintain these marginally survivable conditions. Ezra asked detailed questions. How much wood did Henry cut each year? Approximately 15 cords. How often did the fire go out overnight? Never intentionally, but it had happened 3 times that winter when the family slept too deeply to maintain it. What happened when the fire went out? The cabin became dangerously cold within 2 hours. How long could they survive if trapped inside during a severe storm? Perhaps 4 or 5 days before wood supplies ran low and rationing became necessary. Henry answered these questions with growing irritation. Everyone knew cabins were cold. Everyone knew heating required constant wood burning. Everyone knew winters were dangerous. These were simple facts of mountain life. Why was Ezra asking such strange questions? Ezra visited James Pritchard next. James was 62 years old, one of the first settlers in this particular valley. His cabin was larger than most, built with care over the course of 1 full summer. But it suffered the same problems: massive wood consumption, uneven heating, smoke infiltration, cold walls and frozen corners. James's wife had chronic breathing problems that worsened each winter from smoke exposure. The pattern held across every cabin. Families clustered near their fires. Children and elderly suffered most from the temperature extremes. Massive amounts of labor went into cutting, splitting, and hauling firewood, only to burn through it at rates that barely kept people alive. Every family lived with the knowledge that a sick person unable to maintain the fire, or a severe storm that prevented wood gathering, or a simple miscalculation of supply could mean death. Ezra began taking notes in a small journal he purchased from a traveling merchant. He recorded wood consumption rates, cabin sizes, fireplace dimensions, and temperature estimates. People thought his behavior was odd, a manifestation of grief over Thomas's death. Mountain folk were accustomed to eccentric behavior from men who had lost family members. They tolerated his questions and measurements with patient sympathy. Ruth Dalton, Ezra's wife of 12 years, watched her husband's obsession develop with concern but also understanding. She had known Thomas well. She had seen the frozen body and attended the burial. She understood that Ezra was not simply grieving. He was trying to solve the problem that had killed his brother. If his method seemed strange, at least it gave him purpose beyond simple sorrow. By early spring of 1868, Ezra had filled 30 pages with observations and calculations. He had identified the central problem clearly. Conventional fireplace heating was fundamentally inefficient. Heat rose directly up the chimney. Smoke filled living spaces. Wood consumption was massive. Temperature control was impossible, and the system required constant human attention that became lethal if that attention failed. What Ezra needed was a completely different approach. Not an improved fireplace. A different system entirely. In April of 1868, Ezra traveled to Charleston to sell his winter's accumulation of furs. The journey took 5 days by horse, descending from the mountains into the valley settlements and finally to the growing city on the Kanawha River. Most mountain men spent their time in Charleston drinking, gambling, and enjoying temporary comfort before returning to isolation. Ezra spent 2 weeks in the city library. The librarian, a thin man named Mr. Pemberton, was initially suspicious of this bearded mountaineer requesting books on architecture and engineering, but Ezra's earnest questions and careful handling of volumes won the man's cooperation. Pemberton brought him texts on building construction, heating systems, and eventually a leather-bound book on Roman architecture published in Boston in 1853. Ezra found what he was looking for in a chapter titled Hypocaust Systems of the Ancient World. The Romans, he learned, had heated their bathhouses and wealthy homes using a method that seemed almost magical. They built fires in external chambers. Heat and smoke traveled through spaces beneath floors and inside walls. Rooms stayed warm without any fire inside them. Occupants breathed clean air while radiant warmth rose from the floor itself. The illustrations showed cross-sections of Roman buildings. Underground chambers held fires. Channels carried heat horizontally. Pillars supported floors above the heating spaces. The system required significant construction effort, but once built, it provided efficient, clean heat using less fuel than open fires. Ezra studied these pages for hours. He copied diagrams into his journal. He read about draft principles, heat retention, and thermal mass. The Romans used stone and tile because those materials were abundant in their world. But the principle did not require stone. The principle was about moving heat from an external source through protected channels into living spaces. He began sketching adaptations. Roman stone channels could become log-lined tunnels. Underground pillared spaces could become crawl spaces. Roman tile floors could become gapped plank floors. The specific materials were different, but the engineering principle remained valid. Create an external fire. Protect the heat path from weather. Deliver warmth to where people lived without bringing smoke with it. Mr. Pemberton noticed Ezra's intense focus and brought him additional texts. A manual on mine ventilation explained draft calculations. A builder's guide discussed wood joinery techniques. A geological survey described how earth temperatures remained stable below frost depth, providing natural insulation. Ezra purchased 3 books with money from his fur sales. He returned to the mountains in early May with ideas that would have seemed insane to anyone he tried to explain them to. He was going to build a Roman heating system in the Appalachian wilderness, using logs instead of stone. He was going to put his fire outside his cabin instead of inside. He was going to heat his home through a tunnel. Henry Blackwell saw Ezra return with books and asked what he had bought. Reading about how Romans stayed warm, Ezra said. Henry laughed and told the story to neighbors. Ezra's reading Roman books now. Next he'll be wearing a toga. But Ezra was already planning his construction. Summer of 1868 brought Silas Mackworth to the mountain settlements. Mackworth was a traveling tinker who made circuits through Appalachian communities twice yearly, selling metalwork and repairing tools. He traveled with a mule loaded with iron stock, finished pieces, and portable forge equipment. His craftsmanship was excellent, and mountain families saved their metal repair needs for his visits. Ezra met him at Henry Blackwell's cabin, where Mackworth was reshoeing a horse. Ezra waited until the work finished, then asked if Mackworth could fabricate custom pieces to specific dimensions. Mackworth said he could, depending on the requirements. Ezra showed him sketches from his journal. He needed iron grating with bars spaced 1 inch apart, measuring 2 feet square. He needed 6 heavy brackets with bolt holes for mounting to wood. He needed 12 iron pins, each 18 inches long and ½ an inch diameter. And he needed hinges, substantial ones, capable of supporting heavy weight. Mackworth studied the sketches with growing interest. "What's this for?" he asked. "A heating system," Ezra said. "Fire stays outside the cabin. Heat comes in through a tunnel." Most men would have dismissed this as nonsense. Mackworth had traveled widely and worked with enough engineers and builders to recognize an interesting idea when he heard one. "Tell me how it works," he said. Ezra explained the Roman Hippocaust principle adapted for mountain construction. External fire chamber built into hillside, log-lined tunnel carrying heat, floor system distributing warmth, no smoke inside. Steady temperature, minimal fuel consumption. Mackworth asked technical questions. How would draft work? How would he prevent tunnel collapse? What about moisture? Ezra had answers drawn from his library research and his own calculations. The tinker nodded slowly. "Romans were clever bastards," he said, "and you might be clever too if you can build this with logs." They discussed materials. Iron grating would cover the fire chamber opening, preventing debris from entering the tunnel while allowing heat flow. Brackets would reinforce the tunnel entrance where it penetrated the cabin wall. Pins would secure horizontal logs at critical stress points. Hinges would mount access doors for maintenance and fuel loading. Mackworth quoted prices. The metalwork would cost $12, significant money for a mountain man. Ezra agreed without hesitation. Mackworth said he would fabricate the pieces during his summer circuit and return in September with finished work. Henry Blackwell had been listening from beside his cabin. After Mackworth moved on to the next homestead, Henry approached Ezra. $12 for metalwork? For a tunnel? Ezra, that's near half what you made on your furs. It's an investment, Ezra said. In what? A hole in the ground? Henry shook his head. You're wasting money and time on crazy ideas. Your brother dying affected you worse than folks thought. Ezra did not argue. He returned to his cabin and began planning the excavation. He had 3 months before Mackworth returned. That was exactly enough time to dig a tunnel into the mountain and build a fire chamber that would prove everyone wrong. Ezra chose his construction site in late May of 1868. The location was unusual by every standard of mountain cabin building. Most settlers built near water sources for convenience. Ezra selected a spot 50 yards uphill from the creek against a steep earth bank that rose another 30 feet above the building site. The position meant harder work hauling water, but it gave him exactly what he needed, a hillside to tunnel into. He began excavation on June 1st. The work was brutal. He used a mattock to break the soil and a shovel to remove it. The earth bank consisted of clay mixed with rocks, ranging from fist size to boulders requiring leverage and cursing to extract. He worked from dawn until the heat of midday drove him to rest, then resumed in evening coolness until darkness stopped him. The tunnel entrance started as a vertical cut into the hillside. Ezra dug horizontally into the bank, creating a passage 4 feet wide and 4 feet tall. Every shovelful of earth had to be carried out and deposited away from the entrance. Every rock had to be hauled clear. The work progressed at roughly 2 feet of tunnel length per day. After 1 week, he had penetrated 7 feet into the hillside. After 2 weeks, 12 feet. The tunnel angled slightly upward to prevent water accumulation. Ezra reinforced the roof with temporary timber supports as he advanced, preventing collapse. The surrounding earth was surprisingly stable, dense clay that held its shape well. At 15 feet depth, Ezra began excavating the fire chamber. He widened the tunnel into a room 8 feet across and 7 feet from floor to ceiling. This expansion required another 2 weeks of labor. He removed approximately 6 tons of earth and rock to create the chamber. His hands developed calluses on top of existing calluses. His shoulders ached constantly. Ruth brought him meals at the worksite and watched with silent support. The fire chamber floor received special attention. Ezra dug down an additional foot and filled the depression with flat rocks he hauled from the creek bed. He fitted the stones tightly, creating a level, fireproof surface. On this base, the fire would burn without scorching earth or creating mud. For the chamber walls, Ezra applied a coating of wet clay mixed with sand and small stones. He worked the mixture into the earth walls, creating a hard surface that would resist erosion from heat. The clay came from deposits near the creek. He carried it uphill in a wooden bucket, load after load, applying it in layers that dried between applications. The ventilation shaft was critical. Ezra dug upward from the fire chamber ceiling at a steep angle, breaking through to the surface 15 feet above. The shaft was 8 inches in diameter, just large enough to create draft while preventing rain intrusion. He lined it with flat stones to prevent collapse. By late July, the fire chamber was complete. Ezra stood inside the space he had carved from the mountain and felt satisfaction earned through 2 months of back-breaking solo work. The tunnel connecting the fire chamber to where the cabin would stand required a construction method Ezra had invented in his journal sketches, but never tested in reality. He needed a passage that would contain heat, withstand earth pressure from above, and last for decades without rotting or collapsing. Traditional log cabin construction used vertical stacking with notched corners. Ezra's tunnel demanded horizontal log walls built in a confined space underground. He selected timber with obsessive care. White pine grew abundantly on the surrounding slopes, and Ezra chose trees between 10 and 12 inches in diameter with minimal taper. Straightness mattered more than size. A perfectly straight 8-inch log was more valuable than a 12-inch log with curves or irregular growth. He felled 22 trees over the course of 1 week, cutting them into 8-foot lengths and hauling them to the construction site using a horse and drag chains. Stripping bark was tedious but essential. Bark retained moisture and created irregular surfaces that prevented tight fitting. Ezra used a draw knife to remove every trace of bark, then smoothed the log surfaces until they were uniformly round. Each log required 2 hours of shaping. He worked through mid-August heat, covered in wood shavings and sweat. The tunnel construction began at the fire chamber and advanced toward where the cabin wall would eventually stand. Ezra laid 2 logs parallel on the tunnel floor, 4 feet apart. These formed the base. He notched the ends where they met the fire chamber wall, creating stability. Then he began stacking logs horizontally along each side, building miniature walls that rose from floor level. The corner joints were where Ezra's technique diverged from standard cabin construction. Instead of notching logs to interlock, he cut flat surfaces where logs met at right angles. The joints were simple butted connections, but he reinforced each one with wooden pegs driven through both logs simultaneously. Every 4th course of logs received an iron pin from Mackworth's order, creating rigid connection points that prevented any shifting. Between each log, Ezra packed a mixture he had developed through experimentation. Clay from the creek, mixed with dried grass and horsehair purchased from Henry Blackwell's livestock. He added pine resin boiled down from sap he had collected in spring. The mixture was sticky, moldable when warm, and dried to a hard, waterproof seal. He applied it generously, filling every gap between logs. The tunnel roof required particular attention. Ezra laid logs across the top of the walls, then covered them with split planks. Over the planks went layers of bark, then his clay mixture, then finally earth packed firmly. The multi-layer roof would support the weight of soil above while containing heat below. Progress was slow. 22 feet of tunnel required 6 weeks of work. Ezra built from inside the tunnel, working in confined spaces lit by candles, fitting each log precisely. When he emerged each evening, his clothes were soaked with sweat and covered in clay. James Pritchard rode past one afternoon and stopped to watch. He said nothing, just observed for 20 minutes, then nodded and continued on. September brought Silas Mackworth back to the mountain settlements with Ezra's metalwork. The pieces were beautifully crafted. The iron grating had bars spaced precisely 1 inch apart with welds that showed master craftsmanship. The brackets were heavy-gauge iron with bolt holes drilled perfectly. The pins were straight and true. Mackworth had exceeded the quality Ezra had hoped for. "I want to see this system work," Mackworth said. "I've been thinking about your design for 3 months." Ezra began cabin construction with the tunnel already complete beneath the building site. The cabin footprint was 16 feet by 20 feet, modest by some standards but adequate for 2 people. He positioned the structure so the rear wall would align exactly with the tunnel terminus. The tunnel's endpoint stopped 2 feet short of where the wall would stand, allowing him to build the connection carefully. The framed tunnel entrance was critical. Ezra built the cabin's rear wall with an opening positioned 2 to 4 inches below the interior floor level. He constructed a frame using thick timbers mortised together, creating an opening 3 feet wide and 3 feet tall. The frame extended through the log wall, connecting interior to tunnel. He mounted Mackworth's iron brackets around the frame, bolting them through the logs with the iron pins. The brackets distributed structural stress and prevented any shifting. The cabin floor system was Ezra's adaptation of Roman principles to frontier materials. He laid floor joists in the standard manner, but instead of fitting planks tightly together, he left deliberate gaps. The gaps were 3/4 of an inch wide, consistent across the entire floor. In the area directly in front of the tunnel entrance, the gaps increased to 1 full inch. These openings would allow heat rising from the tunnel to enter the living space. Mackworth helped install the iron grating over the fire chamber opening inside the tunnel. The grating would prevent debris from entering the tunnel while allowing maximum heat flow. They secured it with brackets mounted to the chamber walls. Ezra built a small wooden door on iron hinges to close the tunnel entrance from inside the cabin. The door allowed access for maintenance and could be opened to maximize heat flow or closed to reduce it. The interior fireplace went up beside the tunnel entrance. Ezra built it from creek stones and clay, creating a conventional-looking heating source that would serve dual purposes. It provided backup heat and cooking capability, but more importantly, it disguised the tunnel entrance. Visitors would see a normal fireplace and not immediately notice the unusual opening beside it. On October 3, 1868, Ezra lit the first test fire. He crawled through the tunnel into the fire chamber and built a small blaze using dry kindling and split oak. He waited inside the cabin while smoke and heat began flowing. Within 30 minutes, warm air was rising through the floor gaps. Within an hour, the cabin temperature had increased 15 degrees. There was no smoke inside. The system worked exactly as Roman engineers had understood 2,000 years earlier. Winter of 1868 through 69 arrived with cold rain in November that turned to snow by early December. Ezra kept his external fire burning continuously, adding wood twice daily by crawling through the tunnel to the fire chamber. The system required approximately one-third the fuel his neighbors consumed. His cabin maintained steady temperatures between 60 and 65 degrees, regardless of outside conditions. Henry Blackwell noticed smoke rising from behind Ezra's cabin rather than from a traditional chimney. The smoke was faint and dispersed quickly, nothing like the thick columns pouring from conventional fireplaces. Henry visited on a December afternoon when temperatures outside hovered near 20 degrees. Inside Ezra's cabin, Henry removed his coat within minutes. The warmth was undeniable, but more striking was the complete absence of smoke. The air was clean and breathable. Henry walked the cabin perimeter, noting the gaps in the floor planks and the strange opening beside the fireplace. "What is that?" Henry asked, pointing at the tunnel entrance. "Heat tunnel," Ezra said. "Fire burns in a chamber outside. Heat travels through the tunnel and rises through the floor." Henry crouched and peered into the darkness of the tunnel. He could see the horizontal log construction extending back into the earth. "You built a tunnel into the mountain to heat your cabin?" "Romans did it with stone. I did it with logs." Henry stood and shook his head. "Ezra, you spent 4 months digging and building when you could have just built a bigger fireplace. This is extra work for the same result." "Not the same result," Ezra said. "No smoke, less wood. Steady heat." "Sure, it's warm now," Henry conceded. "But winter's just started. Wait until January. Wait until real cold comes. You'll be back to burning wood like everyone else, except you wasted a summer building a hole in the ground first." James Pritchard visited a week later. The old man was more thoughtful than Henry. He examined the tunnel entrance carefully, felt the warm air rising from the floor gaps, and asked detailed questions about construction methods. Ezra explained the horizontal log technique, the clay chinking mixture, the fire chamber design, and the ventilation shaft. "How much wood you burning?" James asked. "Maybe 2 cords so far this winter." "I've burned 5, James said. "And my cabin's colder than yours." "System works," Ezra said simply. James nodded slowly. "It does, but I'm too old to dig tunnels. If I was your age, I might try it, but at 62, I'll stick with what I know." William Garrett, a young trapper of 26, stopped by in January. He was polite and curious, examining the system with interest. "Clever," he said, "but it's a lot of work for a bachelor. When I marry and settle permanent, maybe I'll build something like this. For now, a simple cabin suits me fine." The consensus remained unchanged. Ezra's system worked, but the effort required exceeded what most men were willing to invest. The storm system that would become known as the blizzard of 1869 arrived on February 9th with little warning. Temperatures had been moderate for 3 days, melting snow and creating false optimism that winter's worst had passed. Then the wind shifted to the northwest and the temperature dropped 30 degrees in 4 hours. Snow began falling at midday on February 10th. By evening, visibility was reduced to 20 feet. By midnight, wind speeds exceeded 60 miles per hour, creating drifts that buried fences and wood piles. The temperature fell to 10 below zero, then 15 below. The storm intensified through February 11th and 12th, showing no signs of weakening. Inside Ezra's cabin, Ruth sat at the table mending clothes while Ezra maintained his journal by candlelight. The temperature inside held at 68 degrees. The only sound beyond wind howling outside was the faint whisper of heated air rising through floor gaps. Ezra crawled through the tunnel twice daily to add wood to the fire chamber. The tunnel protected him from the blizzard completely. He could tend the fire in his shirt sleeves, while outside the storm killed anything exposed. Through the small window, when wind briefly cleared the air, Ezra could see Henry Blackwell's cabin a quarter-mile distant. Thick smoke poured from Henry's chimney, the desperate output of a fire being fed constantly. Ezra knew what that smoke meant. Henry was burning wood as fast as he could split it, trying to keep his family from freezing. He was probably going through half a cord every day. At that rate, his supply would last perhaps one more week. On February 13th, the storm showed its full power. Wind speeds reached 70 miles per hour. Snow accumulated to depths of 3 feet on level ground, 5 feet in drifts. The few settlers who tried to reach their woodpiles or check on livestock risked their lives doing so. 2 men in the lower valley died of exposure trying to retrieve animals from a barn 50 yards from their cabin. Ezra's system required no outside exposure. The fire chamber entrance was inside the tunnel, accessible from the cabin without stepping into the blizzard. He maintained the fire easily while other families fought for survival. On February 14th, the 5th day, the storm finally broke. Wind diminished to occasional gusts. Snow stopped falling. The sun appeared briefly through thinning clouds. The temperature remained brutally cold, but visibility returned. Ezra put on heavy clothes and snowshoes and began checking on neighbors. He reached William Garrett's cabin first. The door was blocked by a drift. Ezra dug through and entered. William Garrett lay frozen on the floor beside his dead fireplace. The cabin's interior was 20 degrees. William had exhausted his wood supply on the 4th day and died during the night. Henry Blackwell's family was alive but in desperate condition. They had perhaps 2 days of wood remaining. James Pritchard's cabin was filled with smoke from a partially blocked chimney. His wife could barely breathe. The blizzard had proven everything. Spring of 1869 brought survivors together to bury William Garrett and account for losses across the mountain settlements. 7 people had died during the blizzard from cold, smoke inhalation, or exposure attempting to retrieve firewood. Dozens of others had suffered frostbite or respiratory damage. Every family had burned through wood supplies at catastrophic rates. The storm had revealed the fatal inadequacy of conventional heating methods. James Pritchard arrived at Ezra's cabin in April with specific questions. He wanted measurements, timber specifications, excavation techniques, and chinking recipes. Ezra provided all information freely, sketching diagrams and explaining principles. James spent 3 days taking notes, then returned home to begin his own tunnel construction. By summer's end, James had a functional system that kept his cabin warm through the following winter while using half his previous wood consumption. Henry Blackwell came in June, pride swallowed by necessity. "Show me how to build what you built," he said simply. Ezra helped him select a site and plan the excavation. Henry was younger and stronger than James. His tunnel and fire chamber were completed by October. His family spent the winter of 1869 through 70 in warmth they had never experienced before. Word spread through mountain communities along a network of family connections and trading relationships. Men who had dismissed Ezra's system as eccentric nonsense reconsidered after the blizzard. The phrase Dalton heating began appearing in conversations. Some called it tunnel warming. Trappers and settlers building new cabins incorporated the design. Existing homesteads were modified. Tunnels dug into hillsides behind cabins built years earlier. The technique spread throughout the Blue Ridge Mountains over the following decade. Variations emerged based on available materials and individual skill. Some men built shorter tunnels with smaller fire chambers. Others created elaborate systems with multiple tunnels feeding different areas. But the core principle remained constant: external fire, protected heat path, clean air inside, efficient fuel use. Historians later estimated that 12 to 15 families survived subsequent harsh winters specifically because they had adopted tunnel heating systems. The exact number was impossible to verify because survival often went unrecorded, but accounts from the 1870s referenced multiple instances of families weathering severe storms in warmth while neighbors struggled. Ezra and Ruth raised 2 children in their tunnel-heated cabin. Ezra continued trapping and hunting, but never sought recognition for his innovation. When men asked for instruction, he provided it freely. When travelers expressed interest, he explained the system patiently. He considered the knowledge too valuable to hoard. Ezra Dalton died in 1891, at age 64, peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by family. He was buried beside his brother Thomas on the ridge overlooking the valley. His gravestone made no mention of tunnels or heating systems. To his family, he was simply a good man who had lived well. But scattered throughout the Blue Ridge Mountains, abandoned cabins still show evidence of horizontal log tunnels extending into hillsides. Modern hikers occasionally discover these openings and mistake them for root cellars, never knowing they are looking at innovation born from tragedy, knowledge shared freely, and lives saved quietly through engineering over heroism.